Hi, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Renee Menard. I'm a Fulbright researcher from California, and I am doing my research project in Quezon Province. So I'm really excited to be here in Baguio and to be with all of you to share a bit about the research I've done and what brought me here to the Philippines. So as you can see, my passion is bringing youth and community members who are impacted by social issues into the fold when it comes to research and policy advocacy. I studied political science at DePaul University, and then I moved to San Francisco, California, where I worked at a nonprofit organization called the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice. So for the past 5 years, I've had the opportunity to conduct research that had immediate social impacts within California's political landscape. In particular, one experience that I wanted to reflect on a little bit with you was a really poignant moment I had conducting this style of research a few years ago. I sat across the table at a restaurant with 3 young men across from me. We had just ordered our food, and they had each looked up at the menu with a really blank stare, and I could sense the nervousness coming off of them. I asked one of the young men, "What would you like to eat?" He ordered a 2-taco plate, we are in California, and then the other 2 immediately followed suit and ordered the exact same meal. So we're sitting there, our meal has just arrived, and we start to talk. We're talking about home, we're talking about family, but the conversation doesn't stay light for long. The reason for this is that their home had been full of barbed wires, steel doors, pepper spray in their faces, violence at the hands of staff and other youth. Their home had been California's Division of Juvenile Justice. This photo here is a unit in one of the 3 remaining facilities in California that houses youth who are involved in the justice system. Here in the Philippines, it would be known as CICL, Children in Conflict with the Law. So as you can see, the conditions of these facilities are very much like a prison. Youth, on average, spent about 2.5 years there, and they could stay from when they arrived as teenagers up until age 25. So the 3 young men that I had spoken with were being interviewed as part of a monitoring report. This institution, like many, do not have very much monitoring or transparency of their conditions. In this case, youth were sent away from home, sent away from their families, and their experiences were left in the dark. So I had the privilege to uplift these voices in my research and bring to life the experiences that these young men shared. So I talked a little bit about the conditions, and you can see here that there were many issues with the day-to-day life of young people in these facilities. But of course, we want to know about outcomes. So in California, the state tracks the outcomes for re-entry. We call it recidivism, so that is essentially what happens when people return home. So here you can see that according to the state's own data in California, we have really abysmal outcomes when youth leave the Division of Juvenile Justice and return to their home. 75%, just about, of youth are rearrested within 3 years, and over a third of youth are returned to state custody, meaning the Division of Juvenile Justice or an adult prison within that same period. The thing is, though, research, in my opinion, needs to go beyond numbers, especially when we're talking about social issues and human impacts. The challenge that I have, and that I'm most interested in exploring with my research, is bringing to life the humans behind the 1s and 200s and 3,000s. In this case, bringing to light the children's voices that they were when they went into these facilities, and then the adults that they were when they came out. So if we could just take a moment to reflect on the words of these young men, who were one of many who came forward and shared their stories as part of this monitoring report. One said, "Do you know how weird it was to be able to open my own door when I got home? Another reflected that when I came out, I was different. And yet another said that I was a kid when I was locked up, and I was an adult when I got out. So one of the main impacts that we saw as a thread through the experiences of these young people was the impact of institutionalization. So as I mentioned before, the 3 young men ordering the exact same meal was not just a funny quip, but it was the fact that they had been denied the opportunity to make their own decisions for years. And so when they returned home, the option to even choose an item off a menu was overwhelming. So I'd like to take a few steps back. I've been very privileged with the research that I've done at the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice, but of course, just like all of you, there are seedlings that are planted earlier to bring us forward in our careers and our lives. So for me, my passion to uplift the voices of people who have been impacted by incarceration in particular and social injustices more generally began when I was in Chicago. I went to school at DePaul University, and in moving 2,000 miles away from home, this was my first opportunity to feel like a fish out of water. In California, I had only ever known the water that I swam in, and I didn't really question it quite so much. But in going to a new environment, I became critical. I saw the racial injustices embedded into the city's infrastructure. I saw the impacts of political themes that existed within these communities, and I saw the widening disparities between different classes. So one of my first experiences in Chicago was a class I took on the juvenile and criminal justice system within the county. Now this wasn't in a classroom at all, it was actually an immersive course. So I had the opportunity to speak with public defenders, speak with prosecutors. I even attended an autopsy done on an infant in the city morgue. And I had an opportunity to walk through the halls of Chicago's sprawling jail system. And it was there that I became very aware of what was happening right under my nose, all of our noses. And those concerns stayed with me. Now, I did spend time in classrooms. In particular, I spent a lot of my time in a preschool classroom. I was interested in early childhood education when I was in Chicago, and I spent 3 years with a national reading and literacy program that was intended to lessen the gap between children who were in under-resourced communities and their more affluent peers. Now, in this program, the attempt was to utilize education as a way to move young people forward at a very young age, to increase their opportunities in life and their opportunities to thrive. But something that's rampant within the U.S. education system is the targeting of Black and Latino youth of color more generally, in systems that set them up to fail. So when I looked at the faces of the 3, 4, and 5-year-olds that I worked with daily, I couldn't help but have my heart break a little bit for their futures, because they each deserve to thrive in school and in life. And instead, many of them would be faced with experiences in jail, in prison, and being pushed out of school settings. So my interests sort of shifted. I think education has the opportunity to have really long-term impacts within communities and within individual lives. But I don't see it as a one-size-fits-all sort of solution. I think, in particular, my concerns lie with people who are falling through the cracks now, people who are falling into the trap set by current systems today. So, moving forward, I did continue in Chicago, having opportunities to explore this new passion. I interned with the Public Defender's Office while I was there, and I also spent time doing a restorative justice course inside of a maximum security prison. While I was there, I continued on as a researcher with incarcerated peers, and we conducted a survey on voting rights and voting interests among incarcerated populations. So this ignited my interest not only in contributing to change within this field, but working directly with the people most impacted by these issues. Because the expertise that they held was unlike any other that I'd had opportunities to glean insight from. So, flash forward, I went to San Francisco, back to my home state, and it wasn't just to return home, but it was because I was really interested in going back to California, which in some ways acts as a domino state. So, California, for better or worse, enacts a policy, and over the coming decades, you see many other states following suit. So while I was in California at the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice, my research spanned the juvenile justice system both within incarcerative settings and in rehabilitative settings in communities. And something that is very clear to us in California and across the US is the impact of youth arrest rates. So something that we can see happening throughout the country is this massive decline in youth crime. Now this is key here because if we look back to the 80s and 90s, the cultural sentiment in California and in the United States more broadly was that things were getting worse. People believed that youth were going to commit more and more crimes in the coming decades, and that we needed to be prepared. So policies were enacted that were highly punitive and sent many young people into incarcerative settings. But what we see is that actually 1996 was the peak of youth arrests in the United States. 2.7 million youth were arrested at that time, and since then, we've had drops at 74%. To put this in perspective, during the same time, adult arrests had declined by 24%. So this is massive. And with it comes an opportunity to think differently about our systems and to think about the impacts that our current policies have on young people. But what I find very interesting here is that I just described a bit of a California example where we had highly punitive policies enacted, and then we moved into a direction where reforms are attempting to treat children in more rehabilitative ways and keep them connected to their community. Now this is part of a broader phenomenon within the realm of juvenile justice. Two researchers conducted a massive review of juvenile justice policies within the United States over a 200-year span. Now these researchers found a really fascinating cycle to occur. Conveniently, they called it the cycle of juvenile justice. So we can easily understand what happens. First, there's a belief that crime is unusually high. And note that this is not about what is actually happening, this is about public perception that fuels policies that are highly punitive. Then those punishments are enacted, and then what happens next is that people think that the situation has been made worse. Perhaps people become aware of the human rights abuses within the current system, or they think that crime is still going up. So what we have next are reforms. Major reforms are enacted to attempt to improve the system once again. And then we're back to the beginning. This is making a little noise. Then we're back to the beginning, where policies and practices that are more punitive are enacted because people believe again that crime is unusually high. Now this cycle is very important to understand because it's not just something that has happened in the past 200 years, but it's continuing to happen today. I explained a little bit about that example in California. We had a huge surge of tough on-crime policies within the United States in the 80s and 90s, which sent many, many people to prison. And since then, we've had a swing of reforms attempt to roll back those harms. There have been issues with major overpopulation within jails and prisons and abuses that occur in these systems. So where California and the United States is a little bit going back up to the top. We're seeing efforts to roll back reforms. We're seeing opportunities for public perception of crime to fuel a return to punitive measures. And similarly, my interest in the Philippines grew from this very same phenomenon. So in 2006, the Juvenile Justice and Welfare Act here in the Philippines caught my attention because this was an act that, in fact, was very progressive in comparison to the United States. In it, the Philippines legislature defined children in conflict with the law instead of juvenile delinquents, so they understood that language matters and that treatment of children should be as children. And this policy, for anybody who's unfamiliar, also enacted a movement toward community-based interventions for young people. And it set the age of criminal responsibility at 15. And now what we've seen is since then, there have been issues with implementation of these community interventions. Of course, the Philippines is a broad, diverse country, and so implementation is challenging across so many different regions. And the finances that are required to come with it for its success oftentimes don't trickle down. And of course, when it comes to the age of criminal responsibility, in recent years, there have been efforts to roll that back to as young as 9. Now, regardless of what you believe in regards to these specific policies, I want to encourage us all to think about how these policies are in relationship with this kind of cycle. Because really what we need to do is break it. And one of the first things that we can do as researchers, as scholars, as generally curious people, is recognize that policy is not in existence in a silo. So when we look at this cycle of juvenile justice reforms, there's a core belief there. And that belief is that policy is what starts and ends social behaviors. But there are so many expansive social conditions that have a huge impact on people's behaviors. Take, for instance, the COVID pandemic. We've seen major fluctuations in crimes across the US and internationally. And we can't look specifically to policies without considering the social conditions in which these changes are occurring. Next, there are a few other things we can do. We can focus, if policy isn't where it starts and ends, let's look at the root causes. In the case of children in conflict with the law, some of these root causes might be their specific needs. So how do we address their needs for basic resources, food, shelter, safety? And also, some of these root causes may be systemic. How do we improve the systems in which we all live? Next, we can explore possibilities outside of the current system, recognizing also that many of these systems are relatively new. We take for granted that many of these ways that we handle harms that are done within communities have been in existence for 10, 15, 50, or 100 years, all of which are relatively new and are not unchanging. And lastly, something that brought me here to the Philippines is this interest in evaluating the programs and placements that we have in existence. So I firmly believe that starts in community. No single person has this information at their fingertips, and what we need to do is collaborate, cross-culturally, and specifically with people who are most impacted by these issues. So this photo is a great example of that. I worked with mothers who were incarcerated in writing a children's book. I wrote a children's book called Dimitri Makes a Memory Quote, and in it, a young boy is navigating the healing process of his mom's incarceration. I recognized that I didn't have that story in myself, and I needed to work with community members to uplift the stories that they wanted to tell. And this was a great opportunity for collaboration, because in this, we were able to utilize all of the earnings for this book to go back to organizations that are supporting families impacted by incarceration. And at the book launch, where you can see this photo, I was surrounded by fellow community activists who themselves had been incarcerated as a parent or had a parent who was incarcerated. So that's really where change can start, in my opinion. I think meaningful change on complex social issues requires this kind of cross-cultural collaboration. So while I'm here in the Philippines, as I mentioned, am in the Quezon province. I'm living on site with a nonprofit organization called Bahay Tuluyan, and they are a children's rights advocacy organization. They support CICL in long-term residential placements as an alternative to other incarcerative settings, and they also support children who have experienced life on the streets more broadly, recognizing again that it's the root causes that we need to be collectively addressing. Now, with Bahay Tuluyan and many other NGOs across the Philippines, there isn't very much information on the effectiveness of these programs, in the same way that there's not a ton of information on the effectiveness of our current systems. So my interest really lies in conducting a participatory action research project here, where I'm engaged with the community, with staff, and with youth to conduct a research project that can meet the needs of people here, that can also fill in the gaps of knowledge that policymakers and government administrators need in order to make knowledgeable decisions. And lastly, to create meaningful change that's mutually beneficial. Because as you can tell from my conversation, the United States does not have this all figured out. We are far from it. And so I have to admit, part of my interest in coming here was not only to contribute to the systems within the Philippines and the improvements that are possible, but also to bring back knowledge to the United States that can be gleaned from the insights that are offered here in the Philippines. Because as Dr. Pascual mentioned before, there's far more that connects us than what divides us. So I want to end on a bit of a reflection about cross-cultural collaboration and something that drives my own interest in international research. This is a bit of a parable by David Foster Wallace, and I'll read it there for you. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually, one of them looks over at the other and says, "What the hell is water?" One of the interpretations of this parable that I really love and that has stuck with me is thinking about the water as culture. So in the same way that my move to Chicago made me feel like a fish out of water and made me acutely aware of the water in which I swim, I think that we all can learn a little bit from that same experience. Culture is the ubiquitous force that is constantly in our presence and constantly invisible to us. So having international experiences, or even experiences that are just a little further from home, or with a community that you're not quite a part of, you can have these opportunities to experience a new lens through which you view the world, and perhaps together we can even change the water that we live in for a more healthy, safe environment. So thank you everybody for being here, for your interest.